honeys, and welcome back to your weekly arts news update with headlines that have been hand-curated by an art historian, yours truly, in fact. This time we're looking back at March 22nd through the 28th and covering all the most interesting and most relevant information for you. A reminder that our March 5-minute musical will be dropping within the next couple of days here, so keep your eyes peeled, and if you want to give that a listen, you'll have to subscribe to our Patreon. It's also been a while since we mentioned that you have a source list available for you in every episode description. Today's include Hyperallergic, Art Forum, Arts News, and the Associated Press, among others. Give that a view if you would like. And now, honeys, we begin with your buzz. We had quite a few updates on stories past this last week, the first of which the UK government has caved and it plans to charge admission to national museums, but only for international visitors. According to a report in the Financial Times, the nation's Department for Culture, Media and Sport, or DCMS, has accepted this among several other recommendations from a report last year aimed at increasing access to the arts in the country. The implementation is, however, quote, conditional on the government first rolling out a universal ID scheme, which would make it easier to differentiate domestic and international visitors, end quote, according to our sources. We also heard that Claire Tabaret's stained glass windows for Notre Dame are facing a new looming legal threat. We've been following the so-called stained glass coral, as the French media regularly calls it, or as Lamond put it more poetically, the windows of discord, which even recently saw widespread confusion both in France and abroad about whether the commissioned windows designed by Tabaret will ever make it into Notre Dame as planned. Our sources noted that, quote, while the Grand Palais show refers to Violette Dulac's original designs, it does not highlight the fact that they are still hanging in the cathedral or that they were recently restored, end quote. But those in the know confirmed to Art News that Tabaret's designs are in fact being interpreted into colorful glass panes for installation, assuming a looming legal battle doesn't interfere. The former director of the Centre Pompidou, who presided over the selection committee for the Window Commission, said that Tabaret and the Atelier Simon Marc are, quote, ardently working in Reims to produce the windows, end quote, and the project should be completed by the end of 2026 as scheduled. However, the Paris-based group Sites and Monuments says that it plans to block in court any attempt to remove Violette Dulac's windows by legally contesting any officially delivered construction permit to that end. The project is widely expected to receive that permit in the coming weeks or months, though it's not a guarantee. The regional prefect could, in fact, theoretically refuse it, although our sources speculate that that is unlikely. Julien Lacaze, president of Sites and Monuments, told Art News, quote, if we can prove that the work of Violette Leduc is of public interest from an artistic or historic point of view, along with the entire classified historic cathedral, we could annul the expected administrative decision to grant a construction permit, end quote. Venice's mayor very publicly warned that Russia's pavilion will be closed if it peddles propaganda at the Biennale last week. Quote, if the Russian government were to carry out propaganda, we would be the first to close the pavilion, end quote, said Luigi Brugnero to the ANSA press agency while addressing media at the opening of the Venice Biennale's revamped $31 million central pavilion. He added, quote, I am pro-Ukrainian. We have twinned Venice with Odessa, and Russia is the aggressor, but we are not at war with the Russian people, and art is open, end quote, while stressing that the event should remain a place for dialogue and cultural exchange. Italian Culture Minister Alessandro Giuili, meanwhile, called for the resignation of his own ministry's representative to the event, Tamara Gregoretti, and demanded full documentation of the Russian pavilion and its compliance with sanctions. And in an escalating step from our previous reports, 37 members of the European Parliament signed a letter that calls for the European Union to cease all funding to the Biennale as of March 27th. That letter reads in part, quote, under no circumstances should Russia, a state subject to extensive European Union sanctions on trade, goods, and services, be permitted to participate in an event financed by European taxpayers' money, end quote. Tensions there have threatened to boil over since the European Union said a few weeks ago that it could withdraw funding if Russia participates in the Biennale. A few days earlier, on March 24th, drone strike damage to a UNESCO-listed 17th century Bernardine Ukrainian monastery resulted in another Ukrainian official, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha, calling for Russia to be banned from the Biennale. The event itself has promised two unusual additions to the show that reference prior protests in an apparent effort to address the controversy, one dedicated to former Biennale president Carlo Ripa de Meana, who decided to shutter the art exhibition and instead mount a presentation about the military dictatorship in Chile in 1973, says the Venice Biennale president of this year. It will involve figures who are, quote, currently unwelcome to their governments from the U.S., Israel, China, Russia, even the EU, end quote. The second, to be titled The Column and the Foundation of Truth, involves programming related to Pavel Florensky, a Russian Orthodox priest who was executed by firing squad by the Soviet government in 1937. Obviously, this is a very high-stakes situation in regards to this huge, incredibly important international event, so we'll continue to follow the story as it unfolds. Speaking of the Biennale, however, the banned South Africa Pavilion show has moved to another venue. Gabrielle Goliath's performance artwork commemorating Palestinian poet Hiba Abu Nada will now go on display outside the main exhibition in Chiesa de Sant'Antonian Church in Venice's Castello district for 3 months starting in May instead of in the South African Venice Biennale Pavilion, which will, meanwhile, remain empty for lack of a replacement. The artist herself had said after the government upheld its decision to exclude her from its pavilion that banning the exhibition had set a quote-unquote dangerous precedent, and I personally agree, so we're happy to see that there will be another opportunity for her to present that work. Looking at follow-ups from the USA, the Kennedy Center has begun staff layoffs, which employees say affected multiple departments, while our sources report these layoffs also included top appointees, Executive Vice President Nick Mead and Vice President Rick Lowery. The fact that the layoffs include those two is significant because it marks the first time that Trump supporters have been included in staff cuts. It's also notable that more layoffs and furloughs are expected ahead of a 2-year closure for renovation. These are arguably consequences of the president's actions, as performers, artists, lecturers, so on, have dropped out by the dozen since Trump took. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security got itself in trouble again for appropriating artworks in a new racist ex-post. The agency used the artwork of Japanese artist Hiroshi Nagai, best known for painting leisurely beach and poolside scenes without people in them, to promote its agenda on the last day of 2025 in a post with the image cropped and superimposed with the phrase, quote, America after 100 million deportations, end quote, and captioned, quote, the peace of a nation no longer besieged by the third world, end quote. Nagai told Hyperallergic via email, quote, I'm disappointed and cannot hide my surprise that a government agency, which is supposed to be strict about copyright, is using my work without permission and attaching political messages that I do not endorse, end quote. The Why We Care here, of course, DHS and its then Secretary Kristi Noem have already come under attack for their continuous unauthorized use of copyrighted artwork and music in social media posts without citations since the 2024 election. This includes paintings by Thomas Kincaid and Morgan Weisling, music by Sabrina Carpenter, Olivia Rodrigo, and Zach Bryan, among other unauthorized uses. And why that unauthorized use matters is pointed at by Nagai's quote there. When government entities blatantly disregard copyright and other legal standards, it erodes the strength of the law and makes it harder to enforce. Furthermore, Hyperallergic points out, quote, while platforms often remove videos that use protected music, image copyright is harder to enforce, end quote, meaning this will be more time and effort by artists and their representatives to fight these breaches instead of making art. We also learned that the White House erected a contentious Columbus statue toppled by protesters in 2020 outside the White House. The replica of that Columbus statue, which was demolished by protesters in Baltimore in 2020, has been reconstructed and installed on the grounds as of March 22nd. Baltimore artist Tillman Hemsley and his son Will Hemsley received a $30,000 grant from the National Endowment of Humanities during Trump's first term in office, which was used to reassemble pieces of the original statue retrieved from where it was dumped by activists in the city's inner harbor. And the Why We Care About This headline, it shows how the pendulum has swung from destroying these symbols to re-venerating them, from investigating the dark sides of American history to burying them. This was, after all, one of more than 30 historical monuments across the U.S. that were forcibly removed by anti-racism protesters in the wake of the May 2020 killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis. In the words of Artforum, quote, Columbus in recent decades has lost the luster bestowed upon him as the so-called discoverer of North America owing to his role as a slave trader and to his brutal treatment of indigenous people, end quote. However, wrote Trump of the reinstallation, quote, Christopher Columbus was the original American hero. I am truly honored that this magnificent statue will now sit on the grounds of the White House, end quote. This pendulum swing seems especially true as we learned the same week that the National Park Service plans to reinstate a statue of Caesar Rodney, a signer of the Declaration of Independence who enslaved more than 200 people at the plantation he owned in Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C., as a planned part of the nation's 250th birthday celebration this summer. In brand new news, however, OpenAI's Sora app is dead, and their $1 billion deal with Disney for it is scrapped as of last week. The company behind ChatGPT has elected to shut down the AI text-to-video generator not long after its official app launch in September, despite Disney's pledge to invest $1 billion in the company and to license some of its characters for use in Sora, an app which allowed people to create realistic-looking AI videos of public figures, which has been riddled with problems since its inception. In an open letter in which they condemned the app's quote-unquote art washing and leaked its source code, creatives and artists who were given access to the beta version in 2024 rejected the technology. OpenAI also had to block Sora users from generating deepfake images of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., after complaints about quote-unquote disrespectful depictions of King on the app came from civil rights leaders' estate last October. A spokesperson for OpenAI said in a statement to CNN about the shutdown of the platform and of the deal, quote, as we focus and compute demand grows, the Sora research team continues to focus on world simulation research to advance robotics that will help people solve real-world physical tasks, end quote. In other words, OpenAI is not getting out of the AI video business. That's one of many tools that can take form in the ChatGPT app, but it seems the company has evolving ambitions, which could potentially be good news for those concerned about everything from AI infringing on artist copyright to those worried about malicious deepfakes. This shows at least one of these AI companies is maybe kinda thinking about what we, the people, really want AI for. Headlines also announced that Ghanaian artist Ibrahim Mahama was allegedly assaulted by state police and is weighing legal action. Mahama was hospitalized after he was attacked on Saturday on a bus after a visit to a mosque in Tamale, Ghana by, he alleges, members of a special operations police unit known as the Black Maria. On Monday, the artist led a press conference to say that he planned to take members of the Black Maria to court over it, stating, quote, I don't think I can even travel for the next month because the last few days I have not even eaten solid food because my lips are all bruised and 3 of my teeth are broken. I have sores in my mouth, end quote. Mahama's work has appeared in a range of shows, from the Biennale de Sao Paulo to the Venice Biennale, and North Regional Minister of Ghana, Ali Adolf Mabori-Diba, subsequently denounced the attack while also saying that he knew of no activity by the Black Maria in the area and that any attack on Mahama, a diplomat, would not be tolerated. Ghana Police Service also denied Black Maria involvement and called Mahama's claims quote-unquote false in a release announcing an investigation into the attack. The Why We Care here, the incident has, of course, generated a mixture of scrutiny and empathy within Ghana. All 3 of the organizations launched by Mahama in Tamale, plus a Venice Biennale participant, a local gallery of note, and the Foundation for Contemporary Art Ghana all signed a statement in which they called the attack a, quote, disturbing act of police brutality, end quote. But it has also drawn international attention to issues of, quote, various forms of police brutality in Ghana, end quote, in the signatories' words, and the dark possibilities of the realities for Ghanaians who aren't famous enough to sue. Mahama continued when confirming the lawsuit that, quote, if this could happen to me, as known as I am, then what about the people on the street if they, the Black Maria, go for an operation and then they beat someone up and the person dies of internal injuries, who's going to speak for that person, end quote. Unfortunately, that was not the only death last week. According to local media reports and the International Artistic Freedom Organization Artists at Risk Connection, Lebanese artist Ali Sabiedi was reportedly killed on March 19th in an Israeli airstrike. Hyperallergic reports that Sabiedi, quote, painted vibrant portraits and landscapes of his rural hometown in southern Lebanon, often sharing his works on his Facebook page, end quote. The Why We Care here, as put by ARC's executive director, Julie Tribalt, quote, his killing is not only a devastating loss for his family and community, but part of a broader pattern in which artists and cultural workers are killed, displaced, or silenced in Texts of conflict, end quote. This is a reminder of the very real human cost of these conflicts. Finally, we learned that Marika Vilcek, the quote-unquote graceful champion of immigrant artists, died at her home at the age of 89 on Monday, March 23rd in New York. Her death was confirmed by her namesake foundation, which has awarded over $17 million, including unrestricted cash awards for researchers and artists across disciplines, to advance its mission to support immigrant contributions to the arts and research sciences. Hyperallergic writes she is, quote, remembered by her colleagues for her elegant charm and unceasing generosity, end quote. Meanwhile, our sources told us that Chile's new far-right president is slashing the culture budget. Jose Antonio Cast has announced a budget cut of 3% across all ministries as merely one part of what he calls his quote-unquote emergency government, which he deems necessary to address the country's alleged economic and security crises. Barbara Negron, the general director of Chile's Observatory of Cultural Policies, told the art newspaper that Cast's government is a, quote, government with no cultural program, that's for sure, end quote, and why we care about that, the arts and culture workers, as well as people of all walks across the nation, are very concerned about what's to come in the arts, as well as issues like immigration and Cast's rollback of dozens of environmental decrees. According to the publication, the Culture Ministry already ranks 16th in terms of budget, despite attempts by Chile's last president to increase the Ministry of Culture's budget to the equivalent of 1% of all public spending. This marks a hard pivot from his predecessor's policies, therefore. Artforum reports, quote, in a Doge-like fashion, each Chilean ministry was also instructed to submit a report identifying any misuses of public funds to the Ministry of Finance's budget office by March 20th, end quote. Looking to Europe, the Louvre announced plans to restore Rubens's Medici cycle. It will remove the 24 Marie de Medici paintings from public view in order to turn the gallery into a quote-unquote restoration studio where the paintings can be fully restored across a 4-year process, after which they will be reintroduced to the public. The paintings were commissioned in 1621 by Marie de Medici, the Queen to France's Henry IV, and narrate her life through Baroque language. The Why We Care, the iconic museum, is calling work on these canvases, considered by some to be the high watermark of Rubens's career, the, quote, most ambitious restoration in the history of the Department of Paintings, end quote. Our sources say the total cost of the project was not disclosed, but the museum has let it be known that the Society of Friends of the Louvre had contributed $4.64 million towards the project, which ought to give you, honeys, a real sense of what these sorts of major undertakings by museums really cost. Also last week, according to the Greek Reporter, Greece's organized crime division made the arrest of well-known Greek dealer Georgios Sagarakis, who hosted televised art auctions in Athens on Friday for felony charges of trafficking forged and stolen artwork and antiquities. Local authorities had become suspicious of Sagarakis once they saw their own stolen objects up for auction on his show. They then went after the dealer's alleged counterfeit art network following a quote-unquote smoking gun social media post featuring illicit items, and subsequent series of raids throughout Athens resulted in the, quote, seizure of 321 paintings, a majority of which experts said were forgeries, artifacts, and large amounts of cash, end quote, writes Art News. We also learned that the Dali Museum of Florida has acquired Dali's largest work for 254,000 euros or $294,000 and is working on exhibiting plans for the 13-panel Décor de Théâtre pour Bacchanal, which was conceived by the artist as a backdrop for the surrealist ballet Bacchanal, which was choreographed by the Ballet Russes de Monte Carlo. It was completed in 1939 and stands at over 20 meters high and 30 meters wide. And per last week's press release, the Brooklyn Museum has earmarked $13 million to renovate 6,400 square feet of permanent gallery spaces on the third floor for its African art collection by 2027. That collection dates back to the early 1900s and is therefore one of America's oldest institutional collections of art from Africa and the diaspora. The announcement, of course, marks a significant change for this space currently used for on-site storage, but it's also significant the wide support that the plan is getting in lean times for the arts and humanities. The new project will begin construction this summer and is funded by the City of New York as well as federal grants, plus support from the Ford Foundation, the Sills Family Foundation, and individual donors. We also care about the meaning of it. Brooklyn Museum director Ann Pasternak stated, quote, "This is more than a new collection gallery. It's a bold reframing of how African art is understood and celebrated in American museums," end quote. Let's hope they live up to that aim. Last month, a church called St. Peter and Paul in Maastricht suffered damage to its floor, and subsequent repair work may have revealed the remains of a man born Charles de Batz de Castlemore, but who is more popularly known as D'Artagnan, the Fourth Musketeer. According to the Dutch news site L1, several objects uncovered along with the skeleton point to the possibility of it being the real D'Artagnan, but we won't know for sure until a DNA sample extracted from the skeleton's teeth is compared in a lab in Munich against DNA from a known descendant of the Musketeer. We'll update you when we hear the news. Our sources also reported that New School Provost Richard Kessler and Executive Vice President Francisco Pineda announced in a faculty-wide email on March 13th, the Friday before the university's spring break, that New School plans to lay off 15% of the university's full-time faculty and staff by mid-June amid a projected $48 million deficit, largely attributed to enrollment decline. The range of the impending layoffs is unpredictable, but the reduction will be guided by restructuring efforts, so impacts will likely be disproportionately heavy on colleges with more significant program consolidation, like the New School for Social Research and the Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts. The upcoming layoffs are notable as the newest development in the university's heated workforce reduction saga, which Hyperallergic reminds us the American Association of University Professors has called the, quote, largest attempted firing of faculty currently taking place in the nation, end quote. That statement came when 40% of the New School staffers received voluntary separation or early retirement offers last December. The New School is becoming part of this trend, really, of mass layoffs in the humanities, especially across higher education, that we are concerned about. We were also made aware that Springsteen headlined Minnesota's No Kings demonstration. The state took center stage of the Saturday protests against Trump's actions, such as the war in Iran, in the No Kings rallies across the U.S. and in Europe, with thousands of people standing shoulder to shoulder to celebrate resistance to Trump's aggressive immigration enforcement. Springsteen and other speakers praised the state's people for taking to the streets over the winter in opposition to a surge of U.S. Customs and Immigration Enforcement agents. He also performed the song he wrote in response to the fatal shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy by federal agents titled Streets of Minneapolis. The lineup also included a congratulatory video spot from Robert De Niro, as well as the live presences of singer Joan Baez, actor Jane Fonda, Vermont U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, and a long line of activists, labor leaders, and elected officials. The level of celebrity and authority, elected official presence at this and other No Kings protests was very significant. Also notable, the U.S. organizers have estimated that the first two rounds of No Kings rallies drew more than 5 million people in June and 7 million in October, though it's unclear yet if the expected 9 million participants Saturday were present. We do know, however, that more than 3,100 events, 500 more than October, were registered across all 50 states. These protests were mostly peaceful, but some arrests were made. GOP officials remain dismissive of the protests and protesters. And our final story for the day, a new Broadway show has audiences talking in more ways than one. The show, set mainly in the 1970s, the decade in which the groundbreaking work on women's health and sexuality titled Our Bodies, Ourselves was self-published, and occasionally toggling to the present, is about a women's consciousness-raising group whose actors, for the first 15 minutes of Act 2, get naked in order to get real about their bodies. Author Bess Wohl told AP News that she wondered whether Liberation might become known as, quote, that play with the naked scene, end quote, while writing it, but has been grateful to see conversations becoming much larger. To give you a bit of context here, says actor Susanna Flood of the characters in the play, quote, they were growing up in a time when their doctors were male, gynecologists were male, obstetricians were male. There was no conversation about female anatomy that was considered polite, and they needed, as a way of taking agency, to get to know their bodies. So they got naked, end quote. The scene is intentionally uncomfortable, but in important ways. Each character's Mrs. Magazine assignment is for them to describe one thing that they like about their body and one that they don't to the group while naked. This gets people talking along with the characters about how they see themselves through their bodies, what they use them for, and how various scars or moles or muscles signal their value or their history according to those on stage. which is the why we care number one. The discussions around the body being had through these emotional, political, personal lenses, which encourage us all to consider our own relationship to our physical selves, as well as, in general, feminist approaches to the body. Associated Press reports that Wool notes each character approaches the nudity exercise differently, same as the actors playing them do. Quote, "That's part of the complicated contradictions of feminism that I was trying to unpack in the play," end quote. And the cast and crew say that the audiences have been respectful, if sometimes startled, caught off guard. One of the more interesting reactions Wool got was from her own father, who asked, quote, "Do women really talk to each other about their bodies like this?" end quote. Which brings to light the other sort of conversations being had amongst audience members. And the why we care number two. Theatergoers must surrender their phones to special pouches to be secured, which can remain with them, but only be opened by staff once they arrive to the theater. And that means that people seem to be talking to other audience members much more. For example, New Yorker Tracy Bonbrest, who attended Liberation with her book club, says that they found themselves, quote, "much more attentive, immersed in the experience than if I'd had my phone with me," end quote. And that is our show for the day, honeys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember to give us your hot takes on the stories that we've presented via Instagram, via Patreon, via even just comments on this episode, wherever it is you stream. We're excited to hear from you, but in the meantime, hydrate or dihydrate. Take care of yourselves. We'll talk soon. Our intro and outro music was created by Chris Meinhold. Thank you, Chris, for that. But everything else you heard today was courtesy of myself, Celia Bugno. The research, the fact-checking, the hosting, the editing, the producing, so on. Remember to share our content with your friends if you like it, and follow us wherever you stream and on social media.